Hello and welcome back to Constructive Interference. I am your host, Joel Kurtnitis, here as always with Josh Hugo. We have, again, a reminder, social media is up and running, off to the races for the CI Show. Make sure you look us up on Facebook at facebook.com/The CI Show and on Twitter at The CI Show. And we are also on Google Play and iTunes. So make sure you get out there, tell all your friends to hit us up, give us a listen, because we have the most cool program ever, the most important stuff for you to hear, and pretty much just all around the best thing you're going to hear today. Right, Josh?
Oh, absolutely. We're also authoritative and definitely not fake.
Yes, and besides, we're just that much we're just that entertaining. Like, everybody should listen to Constructive Interference. We have the coolest name. I have no idea why we are not yet a top like above Ben Shapiro podcast. But you know what?
Obviously
all
some
good
sort
things
of
come to those who wait.
Conspiracy, I think, to suppress us. I think Zuckerberg is doing something to keep us from getting the audience that we clearly ought to have at this point.
Honestly, I blame Trump. I think he's just opposed to the free press, and that's what's killing our hits. But you know what? We'll get to that in a little bit. This week is Thanksgiving week, which is honestly my favorite week of the entire year. I'm not even kidding. Like, this every single year, this is my favorite week. And the reason is because it's the one week out of the year where people hesitate before they just get complainy and whiny and downright bitchy. It's the one week of the year where people are just they just take a minute and think, should I really complain? That's been my experience. Has that been your experience at all?
Well, I work at home, so I'm mostly around my kids, and my 3-year-old complains regardless. But yes, the general sentiment I agree with.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely love it. It's this one opportunity. I feel like, culture at large, there's some truth to saying that millennials are a supremely entitled generation. And so much of what we hear around peers and coworkers and everything is just constant complaining and constant negativity. And, I'm not exactly an optimistic person most of the time. So, I understand there's real problems and they need to be addressed. And when you're at the work week, there's stresses and whatnot, okay? But there's this lack of thankfulness that really evidences that we really don't understand the fact that we are living in the richest, the freest, the most opportunity-laden time and place in American or in world history. Like, there's just no question. This is the place to be, and this is the time to be in world history, and yet it just seems like everybody hangs their heads. So this is the best week. And that's why we're going to talk about all the best things. But I am so looking forward to Thanksgiving, and I hope that everybody listening to us today has a fantastic Thanksgiving. So we're going to talk about the free press and the not so free press. And there's a trigger this week to the discussion about the press, and that was CNN's Jim Acosta, who decided to pick a fight with the White House. This happened, week before last now. There was a White House press conference at which Mr. Acosta decided to pick said fight. You want to give us the recap on that, Josh?
Well, it wasn't really that atypical of a press conference. Mr. Acosta likes to be combative with the president, and the president likes to be combative with everybody. So Jim stood up and said he wanted to challenge the president and didn't really ask any questions, sort of started one of his lectures. And the president eventually got tired of that and told him to give up the mic and pass to the next reporter. However, in this case, Jim Acosta from CNN did not give up the mic. He decided he's going to hold on to it and continue talking in spite of the president's instructions. At which point, a White House intern stepped in, tried to take the mic, actually got her hands around it, and Acosta sort of brushed her off and kept on talking.
As you say this, I saw the video, but I'm just thinking about it. If I had not seen the video and I was hearing this for the first time, it would sound wildly entertaining. I mean, just describing this to somebody be like, and then he tucked it under his arm and ran for the exit.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it kind of was. I mean, quite honestly, it is an entertaining video. If you
stiff-arm Secret Service on his way out the door.
Yeah, not quite, but sort of a similar vibe.
So I'm gonna guess that this stunt probably got his press pass revoked, right?
Well, yes, it did, and there was some controversy about whether or not that was appropriate. Controversy that in fact became a lawsuit by CNN, supported by Fox News and many other press agencies.
Well, that's impossible. Fox News only does good things. They don't line up with CNN.
Well, it was a paradox, I suppose. The evil Fox News from the parallel universe where Spock wears a beard.
Wololo.
Yes. So yeah, evil Fox News came and supported CNN in this instance. But yeah, so CNN sued, and they put a bunch of stuff in the lawsuit, but basically what it came down to was they claimed that Trump had not used a consistent process for revoking the press pass. And for the time being, at least, they have prevailed, and Trump has been forced to return that press pass. And that's where the story stands at this time.
So you said they prevailed. And when you say they, are we referring to the free press, the quote free press here?
Well, that is it. Well, we're referring to CNN, but that is an interesting point. What is the free press? So this lawsuit was sort of, I guess I'll say, the culmination of this feud and this, I guess, narrative that's been going on for the past couple of months. Trump being combative with everybody. But especially with CNN, with the New York Times, and with some other members of the press who he has repeatedly called fake news, who he has referred to as being, quote, enemies of the people for what he considers to be their inaccurate coverage and their distortions.
So I guess you could say it was only a matter of time until he was accosted by them.
Oh, Joel. Did you have to?
I can't help it. Come on. That's just
wow.
It's such a softball. I mean, it's right there. Sorry, please continue. Ignore that fantastic joke at your own peril.
Yes, I'll try to recover from that. But yeah, so this narrative has been being promoted. I guess USA Today ran a petition a while back, which a whole bunch of media personalities signed off, saying that they oppose Trump saying this, that the free press is the enemy of the people and all that. But what's really interesting is that Trump hasn't actually attacked the free press as such. He has not said anything about that. You and I here are talking to our vast audience, people listening, and no one's stopping us. You and I are here producing this podcast, sending this message out to anybody who pleases to listen to it. And anybody in America can do that. We still have this free press where we can just say whatever we want to and publish it, and no one can stop us. But this narrative about Trump versus the free press, so-called, it really sets it up as if CNN and the New York Times and these few other agencies are the free press. As if, not you and me or anybody else wants to print a pamphlet in their basement or whatever, but as if these few agencies that Trump has opposed, as if they are the free press.
And I'm guessing you don't agree with that.
Very perceptive, yes. Of course, we didn't talk about this before we recorded, so I would give you a hint. But yeah, so it's an interesting phenomenon. So not only with the press, but also with things like the arts, the movie industry. We see this in science. We see this in education. We see this idea that these things, which really are services that people buy, education, for instance. I homeschool my kids. I believe you're planning to when they get to be old enough.
No, we've already started. I mean, our oldest is not quite 4 yet, but I tell you what, he's already doing great. He's already reading and writing and doing simple math, and so yeah, I'd say we're homeschooling already.
All right. So that's education. You and I are doing education in our own homes. You can also purchase education, from private schools, from tutors. But there's this perception that education is not this service that we can get from many places, but education is this institution of the public school and the university system. And there's a similar perception with the press, that the free press is not just people talking and publishing what they want to say, but the free press is these couple of monolithic institutions that sort of act as gatekeepers, and that if Trump or whoever doesn't like CNN, doesn't like the New York Times, doesn't like the Washington Post, or any of these other big names, that somehow opposing them is opposing the idea of free press.
So basically, it's like saying if you don't like McDonald's, then you hate cheeseburgers.
Exactly. Or
sounds legit.
Yeah, sure it is. Or wait, what's your favorite sports ball team again?
Oh gosh, which sport? I'm embarrassed to call myself a Jaguars fan right now. It's difficult.
Right. So if you don't like the Jaguars, then you don't like football. It's kind of the same idea.
Well, no. At the moment, if you don't like the Jaguars, you enjoy your life. That's the equation for now. They're terrible. Anyway,
Yes.
so yes, the free press. So you're talking about basically the idea of the free press doesn't belong to any one group, and I would argue, I guess, and I'm sure that you'd be sympathetic to this, that in the internet age, there's actually a much greater segment of society that constitutes the free press than would have several years ago.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, back when the Constitution, was created back in the 1500s, the free press, of course, the word press comes from the printing press. Literally, the word press comes from pressing a piece of paper between two wooden blocks. That was the press. So at the time, basically anybody who had a printing press and could print off newspapers or pamphlets, well, that was the press. And have a free press just meant that anybody who had one of these presses could print out whatever they want and distribute it. Mm-hmm. And of course, today with the internet, we do that via podcasts or via blogs or whatever. Mm-hmm. But the idea is the same. And it's not this idea that there are a couple of these big gatekeepers who form this leadership or this hierarchy that presides over the press, and that's the free press. No, it's just the idea that everybody gets to talk. And Jim Acosta is no more or less the free press than I am here talking now.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, and I can see a case that these larger organizations could make the case that they're a better in a better position to supply news that we need because they have better access to it, right? Like I can't go out there, I don't have the resources right now, or the contact list, or any of the availability to go out and cover the Middle East right now. I can't do that, but I can tune into the BBC and they can do it. So I think they're looking at it from the perspective of, at least I would assume that they're looking at it from the perspective of, well, we have to protect these large organizations that are capable of pulling back the curtain on the Wizard of Oz, because these smaller groups and these smaller people cannot and will not. And so if we lose that, that large organized resistance, so to speak, then the entirety of the free press will be made vulnerable. So tell me this. In the, removing the dramatization that I just laid out, why should I care about this whole Acosta affair, or about where the press is at in America in general? I mean, that was honestly, Josh, my reaction this week to the whole Acosta thing was just, I'm just tired of it. It's dragged out now. It's become a giant soap opera with Trump, riling up his base by attacking the press, and then the press acting all shocked and horrified and making the issue about themselves, which then compounds the problem. I mean, it's a tiresome, dog and pony show as far as I'm concerned. And when I saw this whole Acosta thing, my first thought, as somebody who's done political messaging and analysis within the context of traditional media outlet, was if everybody's talking about Jim Acosta, that's a victory for Jim Acosta. I mean, the whole point of their feud with the president is get people to talk about them, acknowledge them, for them to become the white knight riding in to save America from this evil orange man. And that's I feel like continuing to discuss it in the way that we are is actually putting them in a position to do exactly that. So tell me, why what is important about this in the context of where the press is at in the U.S. right now?
Well, I think you answered your own question, what you said. First of all, you described the news media. I won't say the free press, because the free press is bigger than just the news media. But the news media as basically a service. Why do we need the news media? I can, of course, form my own opinions. I can talk my own talk, but I really can't go to the Middle East and see what's happening there. I don't have the resources. So what the news media does for us, what it should do for us, is basically act as a service which brings us information. I was thinking of it earlier as this analogy with, say, the water company. It's like I don't have the resources to pipe my own water into my own house. I could walk down to the river, collect rainwater or whatever. But as far as actually having water flowing into my house on demand, I don't have the resources to do that for myself. So I have the water company, which pumps the water in, and that's the service they provide. And the news media, I think, really ought to be sort of a similar idea, whereas they provide me the service of gathering the information that I am unable to gather for myself. So that's, I mean, so that I guess, in a nutshell, that's what the news media ought to do. They ought to be the service that gives me the information that I can't gather for myself. But
that's not what they do anymore, is it?
Well, I mean, there's always been yellow journalism, I mean, we sort of romanticize the past and think, back in the day, journalists were honest, which was never quite really the case.
No. A far cry from it.
Yes. Go see Hamilton. And,
Exactly. That's exactly what I had in mind. Actually, was the founding era. You would basically find someone who had a printing press, make them your friend, and then you could print whatever sort of libel you wanted. And most of the time, you couldn't really trace it to any sort of legal liability anyway. So they would just make up whatever horrible scandals they could, and John Adams eats babies in his bedroom, and
he
like it's
does.
just yeah, I mean, just all sorts of horrible stuff that they would come out with, and
Yeah.
they're they didn't have Snopes to help them out, so you gotta feel sorry for them,
Snopes. That'd be
Yeah,
interesting. Added into the 18th century context where you have Snopes is like a bulletin board. Anyway, but yeah. So I mean, the press has never been perfect. It's never really fulfilled this sort of idealistic service to society that we like to attribute to it. But like you said, that's really not happening very well nowadays. If it ever did, I'm not sure how much it's declined exactly. But nowadays, we know that it's not really providing that function very well. And I think this Acosta case is sort of important because it really illustrates that fact. What was Jim Acosta doing when he had this incident with the president that resulted in his press pass being revoked? He wasn't really asking the president a question. He was getting up and telling the president, "I challenge you," and telling him that he was wrong. He was telling the president that he was wrong about calling this migrant caravan an invasion. He's telling President Trump, you shouldn't call it that, that's not what it is. He wasn't really asking a question. He wasn't really trying to get information for us. He was actually trying to, say, promote a narrative or promote an interpretation of events that he wanted to express. And the coverage of the incident I thought was very interesting because there were these sort of conflicting, not conflicted, there were these partisan narratives that evolved around the Acosta incident. On the left-hand side, you had this narrative that the accusation against Acosta that he had, been very rude and his conduct was, unacceptable in the context of the White House press room. There was this sort of, I'll call it a rumor, that there was a doctored video, that the White House had produced this video that was somehow fake, that showed Acosta performing some violent action against an intern that he didn't really perform. And
he went full karate.
Yeah, pretty much. Or well, that goes to the other side. But yeah, so there was this, and it was even mentioned in the lawsuit that CNN filed against the White House. Mentioned this doctored video, that they produced this doctored video that showed Acosta doing something he didn't do. But if you actually watch the video, it's, as far as I could tell by watching it several times, it's not doctored.
Not significantly, yeah.
Not if it might be altered somehow, but not in any way that matters. It still shows the same thing. So that was the narrative floating around on the left. And the left was all saying, well, the White House is lying with this doctored video. But then there was this other narrative floating around on the right. Now, the narrative about the doctored video, like I said, that was actually in the CNN lawsuit, and that was picked up in a couple of actually leftist media outlets. I saw it in Salon, for instance. I'm not sure if the right-wing narrative was picked up in any major outlet, but I know it had a good go on social media.
Oh, yeah.
And that right-wing narrative was that Jim Acosta beat up this intern. He beat her up. He
think the word assault was used. Yeah.
Yes. Which, again, if you watch the same video, he didn't assault her.
No, I've seen sneezes more violent than that exchange. Yeah. Seriously.
Yeah, he was like super rude. Yeah, sure, but that's all it was. He didn't hurt her. He didn't mean to hurt her. He just said, no, he brushed her aside rudely and wouldn't give the mic up, which is bad, but it's not bad in the sense that it's assault. So in the coverage and the talking about this incident, you have these two competing narratives where the people on the right are trying to slander Jim Acosta, trying to call him an abuser and an assaulter of women when he's not. And on the left, you have the people trying to say that the White House has produced this dishonest doctored video when they didn't do that either. And you just have them basically, instead of reporting the actual news and trying to talk about what really happened and what it means, you have both sides pretty much just making stuff up, trying to get hits on each other.
Yeah, and I think what you said when we were talking about this a while back was actually spot on, which is it's not good enough anymore for someone to just do a bad thing. They have to be the most evil, the most horrible, the most vicious and violent. You have to. It's like the scene from have you ever seen The Other Guys with Will Ferrell and Mark Wahlberg?
Don't think so.
Okay, there's a scene in there where they're going to interrogate someone as two police officers, and Mark Wahlberg looks over Will Ferrell, says, okay, we're going to do good cop, bad cop. So he goes in and roughs the guy up, expecting Will Ferrell to come in and be the good cop afterward. But Will Ferrell actually comes in and just throws the guy on the ground and is even more over the top and more violent with him and just really scares him to death. And then later on, you find out he misheard, and he thought that he said bad cop. And then when he saw Wahlberg get rough with the guy, he knew he had to go even higher, even hotter than that. And so it was kind of a funny moment in a what's honestly a super underrated comedy, in my opinion. But the idea is the same here. It's like, it's not, when you see the left says, oh, there's doctored video, your impulse on the right, for a lot of these folks anyway, is just to come back and say, but no, you assault people. Like, it's not enough. And speaking to the advocacy side of it, I remember a long time ago, back when I was growing up in the 90s, and listening to Rush Limbaugh, back when Rush Limbaugh was kind of the only name in conservative radio. And he I forget what it was. I think it was a correspondence dinner or a journalist dinner, something like that. The keynote address was delivered by a young lady who stood up and said, I got into journalism because I wanted to change the world. And he stopped the tape, with his characteristic dramatic stop the tape, and then just kind of paused for a second and thought, you got into journalism to change the world? That's not what journalists are supposed to do. That's what activists are supposed to do. Journalists are supposed to report the world. That's the point. If you get into journalism to change the world, you are not in the right place. You get into journalism to report the world, to bring the truth to light. That's what you do. Now, if along the way that changes things, as it certainly will, then good for you. But that's not the point. The point is to report and let other people decide. So I would definitely say there's been a rise in that. And again, it's not new. It's not new to our generation. It's not new to our time. And I think you see, if you look in history, you see examples of the good and the bad that can come from that. And there's some of that going on right now too. So we've got, on one side, you have more independent news outlets, you have more competing news outlets, where I think, at least in a lot of cases, you can get a sampling of news from the left and right and come out of it with a somewhat balanced viewpoint. I mean, I read a lot of things where I look at a sensationalist article on the left and then follow it with a sensationalist article about the same thing on the right. And you can come out of it saying, okay, if both of these articles are actually true in any sense, then it's because the truth lands right between them. And here's how you would take it and spin it one way, and here's how you take it and spin it the other way. But then on the downside of it, so on the upside, you have the greater, wider spread of information, and you have more takes on it available. But on the downside is you have this obnoxious rise of fake news. And fake news clearly, it lacks a consistent definition. Some people would argue that, well, I mean, the president has argued that some major news outlets are fake news as well. And so there's clearly a lack of definition there, but it is an annoyance. I mean, there are people who say things from their point of view and then have enough spin on it where people call it fake news. But then there's the real people who make money off of real fake news, as in, I sat down at a keyboard and made something up and slapped a controversial headline on it and threw it out there in order to get hits for advertising. And that, I think, is kind of the more, it's really obnoxious. And what it does is it halts real conversations from happening on things that are immediately relevant to people. Because you have people addressing things. Well, I heard this once. I don't really know where it was from, but it said Hillary Clinton eats babies. So
she does.
Exactly,
just like
right?
Jefferson.
See, you read that too? Unbelievable.
Yeah.
I know. I shared that as soon as I saw it. No, I'm just kidding.
People gotta know.
No, but there's big money in this stuff. There is really big money in it. There was at least one Facebook-focused news writer of fake news who was making $10,000 a month off of ads. And that's on fake news. And this comes, by the way, in a context where traditional news outlets are struggling to get by, because in the internet age, obviously, the high overhead of traditional media outlets has made them has given them a harder time competing with these smaller startup groups. And so I think what the fake news phenomenon is definitely a problem too. And again, we're not unique in history on this, but what do we like? Where's the line for fake news, and what can we even do about that?
Well, like you said, this guy you were talking about on Facebook made $10,000 a month just by making stuff up. Yeah, ching. Where does his money come from? On Facebook, you can't make any money if people aren't clicking the share button on your stuff. So, I mean, where does fake news come from? I think a big part of the problem is because people have stopped trusting the mainstream news media. I used to work for a newspaper back starting in 2005, and even back then, I noticed just the extreme bias in Associated Press articles. You know, the extreme bias against, at the time, President Bush, and then later on the extreme bias in favor of Obama. And people noticed that. I think a lot of people just stopped trusting the mainstream news, and then something is going to have to come and fill in that gap. So that's part of the problem. Is just that there are still a few. I read World magazine, subscribe to that, and a few other companies are actually trying to report real news. But to a large extent, even what you call the mainstream news, what you might call the real news, is really heavily spun. And so people think, hey, if that's fake, I'm just going to believe anything,
Sure.
Like the
sure,
bar
give
has
up
been
on
lowered.
finding the truth in general.
Yeah. But there's also this thing, people love to hear, as the Bible says, what their itching ears want to hear. People love to hear narratives that validate them. And by validate them, I mean people love to hear the world explained to them in a way so that, one, it makes sense to them. They feel like they understand what's going on. And two, they feel like they're the good guy. I understand how the world is. I feel comfortable and secure in my knowledge of how things are. And I'm the good guy in that world. And those two competing narratives that I mentioned for the Acosta story really play into that. You have on the left people saying there's this doctored video. What does that do for them? That if my enemy is using a doctored video, that puts me in the position of being morally superior. It puts me in the position of being the one who cares about facts and truth, and them in the position of being the ones who are sensational liars. Whereas the opposite one, if I'm promoting the story that Acosta assaulted this woman, that puts me also in the place of being the morally superior one. I'm the one who cares about women, and they're the ones who are hypocrites who are assaulting women. And I think really probably the single biggest driver of fake news is just that desire for validating narratives. People see a news story that, and basically the implication of that story is that I'm the good guy, and they, be that the right, left, or whoever you consider to be them from your own perspective, they're the bad guys, I'm the good guy, this story, quote unquote, proves it, and that's why I'm going to share it.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, I think what I look at when I see kind of the way that media is going, and I've actually talked to some folks who are in the industry now about this, and what they'll tell you is the common knowledge is that there's really only two ways anymore to get the hits and make the money in journalism today. You can either be a deep dive investigative reporter who's able to turn over information that nobody else has yet, which in a world that is shrinking to the point that every teenager has a cell phone and everything is put up on Twitter within 30 seconds is very difficult to do. I mean, turning over brand new information, it's not like it once was where you could report on stock prices and have a full-time job. I mean, it's different now. So you could do that, or you can be a partisan bomb thrower. That's really the two options that it comes down to. That's what's going to get you clicks. You're either going to turn over new information that nobody else has, and that's becoming harder and harder to gain exclusivity on because of the speed of information flow, or you can just launch, lob bombs from one side to the other and harvest those clicks from people who agree with you. That's very difficult as somebody who writes an opinion piece, a regular opinion piece for a mainstream outlet. It's very difficult to walk that line and say, I want to bring people information. I want to show people a perspective that's coherent and cohesive and makes sense. But I also don't just want to sit here and provide confirmation bias to people who, identify with my political tribe. And I have to have something new to present them. And that's a real challenge. And it's something that I don't know how you reverse the trend on that, really. And if you look at, the sites the sites or the individuals who are providing some form of real news, they're not doing so hot. Even if you go back to there was an article this week, I want to say about 4 days ago, that the government is optimistic about prosecuting Julian Assange of WikiLeaks. I mean, Assange, that's real news. Like the things that he has that he has alerted the world to through WikiLeaks. That's some of the biggest stories that have broken over the last at least decade. And there's if you look at the response that he's getting, we're going to prosecute him. Now that's not to say that there's not been some classified documents that have been out and that have caused danger to people. I get that, and I understand that there's a threat along with that. But I would argue, and I think Edward Snowden and a lot of other people would argue, that there is an equal threat, if not a greater threat, by leaving so many of these things in the dark. And so,
well, it's not. I mean, of course, he has released information that was illegal to release. So while I might not be sympathetic to it, I can agree that the government has some sort of a duty to prosecute him, even if I don't like it. But what's disturbing is that the other people in the press who are supposed to be reporters, giving us the information, are also against him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's frustrating sometimes, because when you're looking for a place to turn for information, where do you go? And to say that there's places that are uncolored by bias is probably a little pie in the sky. And honestly, again, that's not new to our generation. I mean, I was listening to several years ago a sportscaster here in Iowa who was kind of reflecting. He's an older fella, and he was reflecting on the times before they let fans do the broadcasts, and people were very dry and monotonous and were sort of expected to objectively report, and he's rounding the third base now, and he's heading to home, and the catch is a little slow. No, I mean, that's what you would hear. And then somebody broke the mold by actually acting excited when their team, made a big play or won the game. And it was infectious. It caught on. And now it's hard to find a sportscast that does not feature a local personality who, actively is excited when his team wins or comes up with a signature call, or they, in other words, they don't pretend to be objective anymore. And that's where the market has gone. And then if you go even further back, there is a fascinating story about the development. We were talking about the founding fathers. Right around that same time, there was a fascinating development during the French Revolution, in which part of the collapse of the French government involved the collapse of what you might call state-sponsored journalism. And that was about, it was a time of printing presses becoming popularized. And so, like you said, everybody who had a printing press in their basement started churning out pamphlets, and there was this feeding frenzy to become the next big thing in journalism. And the way that you got hits back then, hits, if you want to call it that, the way that you got read and the way that you got popularized was by making accusations. And so that actually was a contributing factor to the reign of terror, was that a lot of these accusations of prominent individuals and prominent figures as being aligned with the aristocrats were coming from these ma and pa printing presses that really nobody bothered fact checking. And so I understand, as I look at the situation that we're in, there's actually a high potential cost of what we're up against. Because granted, you have access to a ton of information by the internet, but it's a moving target. It's always a moving target. So I feel like there's always a danger there, based on what's profitable, because what's profitable is what people want to hear. That's what they're going to click on.
Yeah, which ultimately throws the ball back into the consumer's court, because in a capitalist free market society, what gets printed is what people are willing to pay for, or perhaps in an ad-driven scenario, what people are willing to share. Mm-hmm. So ultimately, it comes back to us consumers, and I thought of this hashtag, only you can prevent fake news. I think people need to take that to heart and realize that if you are spreading fake news, if you are spreading information that is incorrect, that is sensational, that is biased or whatever, then that's actually a contribution to the problem of the decline of the news media. We need to be responsible consumers who are discerning and who consume, and especially who share, only things that we know are actually valuable.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I would argue that that's, regardless of the source that it comes from, because if you want to encourage good behavior in news organizations that do have the resources to provide us with valuable information, then, they deserve to get the hits when they do something good. They deserve to get the hits when they're reporting news that actually is valuable, that actually is neutral, that actually is helpful. And contrary-wise, if you're not supporting them in that, if you don't make the investment, then, don't be surprised when you're getting your Sunday morning highlights from Red State Watcher in a few years. So not to put too fine a point on it. So yeah, I agree, and we always try to tie things together here at Constructive Interference with something that a way in which this wraps into the rest of our lives. And so I think that's kind of the key for this episode is when it comes to fake news and when it comes to news in general, it's really up to us what we consume, and whatever we choose to consume, we're going to get more of it because that's how supply and demand works. So if we are stuck in that finger pointing and negativity, we're just going to get more of it because it's going to get commercialized and then it's going to become profitable. But if we gain a taste for optimism and a nose for truth, then a lot of these sites are going to have trouble staying up, and they're going to have trouble having the influence that they have today. And I can't think of a better opportunity to start that process than Thanksgiving week. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to follow us on social media again at facebook.com/TheCI Show, Twitter at The CI Show, and on Google Play and iTunes. Everybody have a fantastic Thanksgiving and an amazing week. We will talk to you next time.